Hey, good morning, Jason. I don't know what's going on with my sound right now, but I'm having like echoey problems. I have no idea what's going on, but I sound like I'm talking in a auditorium or something rather than uh, just through a mic. Anyway, I guess that doesn't much matter. All right. Well, it is 7:43. We only have 6 people in here right now. That's kind of Oh, I know why. I don't think I've ever copied this over to Canvas. Whoops. Announcements. Zoom meeting Thursday, 10:22. Boom. There it is. All right, we should get more people in here now. Um, my mistake. While we're waiting for people to join up, I'm going to go fill myself a cup of coffee, and then we'll get started continuing with the Industrial Revolution here. Because they, Arnav, they subscribe to me on YouTube, I think. I am tall. I'm 6'6". All right, folks. Well, I don't know what's going on with my mic this morning, but I'm having this weird issue where, for whatever reason, it's decided to give me this unusual reverby sound to my voice, so I sound like I'm talking through a auditorium or something. Oh, yeah, Arnav, I remember that. Okay. So let's see here. We got to go to, what are we going to? Where's my Industrial Revolution PowerPoint? Here we go. A little bit out of it this morning because, I don't know, I'm just tired. Okay. And then we have to switch this over here. And we got to bring this over to this side. Okay, very good. So, continuing on with the Industrial Revolution, we've been talking about a number of different things, and now we're going to actually change to talking a little bit about how art changes during the Industrial Revolution. So, the last time that we talked about art, we talked about this. We talked about the neoclassical movement in the Enlightenment. And so the Enlightenment is really what came in the period just before the Industrial Revolution. The Enlightenment, remember, lasts all the way through the French Revolution. And the French Revolution really happens as the Industrial Revolution is starting to get underway in England. Okay, so the 1780s, 1790s, early 1800s under Napoleon, that's all the time frame that we've been in for the last several weeks in this class, talking about the French Revolution, Napoleon, and now talking about industrialization in Britain. And the art style that emerges during the early part of the Industrial Revolution, these are a little bit out of order. I should have probably done them in the right order. But the first art style to emerge during the Industrial Revolution is known as Romanticism. And it's a style of art and also literature that emphasizes imagination, emotions. It is unrealistic in the sense that when you think of, even the term romantic, oh, that's so romantic, the idea of romantic is itself a little bit unrealistic, okay? And I think that this is one of the number one things that I see with kids who get into relationships before they're emotionally kind of ready to be in one. I think that people have this perception about I don't know about what relationships are supposed to be like, super romantic or something, and everything's always just really perfect, more perfect than you could ever imagine, and that's not realistic, right? And that can undermine people's expectations, right? So when people expect things to be just so beautiful and wonderful and more amazing than they could have ever imagined, they're romanticizing it, right? Romanticizing it. What they're doing is they're creating these lofty ideals about what they expect, and that is not really very realistic, okay? So to give you an example, here would be a piece of romantic art, okay? You can see that in the art here, it's more perfect, more beautiful. The light is perfect. The umbrella is perfect. The street is empty, except for this other guy, I guess, standing back over here, maybe. You've got the flowers. You're on like a beautiful French street, and oh my gosh, it's just more beautiful than it ever could have been. I'll never forget the time when I first started teaching back in oh God, what year would that have been? 2008, maybe? 2007, 2008. I was still a student teacher at the time. And I was student teaching, and it was raining outside. And I saw students leaving cover from the rain, from their lunch tables, to go and with their little high school sweetheart go and kiss in the rain. And I wanted to vomit directly onto my keyboard and monitor that were sitting in front of me as I was looking out the window, because there was this movie back in the early 2000s called The Notebook, and it was this really, sad movie. A lot of people had seen it, and that's just so weird and dumb, and so anyhow, romanticism, but the style of art that we're talking about here romanticizes scenes, and you have to understand that in the early years of the Industrial Revolution, okay, the early 1800s, they don't have movies yet, okay? There's no such thing as motion pictures. There's no such thing as video yet, okay? Video doesn't exist in that time. There's no technology that would have even allowed you to do that. Photography itself, still photos are barely a thing, okay, in about the 1840s maybe, okay? But certainly there's no such thing as motion pictures or film, movie films or anything like that. And so what do people have? They have paintings, right? And so when people want an escape from our modern day times, when you're sick of hearing about the news, when you're sick of hearing about the election, when you're sick of hearing about the pandemic, what do? You throw on a movie, put on Netflix or something like that, and you can escape from reality for a little while. You transport yourself to a different time and a different place, and it allows you a brief escape from the drudgery of your everyday lives. Well, people were looking to do the exact same thing back in the Industrial Revolution, except for the only alternative that they had to go to was paintings, art for the most part, because there's no movies. And so, when we take a look at the art of the early Industrial Revolution, it's romantic, right? Take a look at this. Another piece of romantic art here. Look at how beautiful, and the light, and the little chateau here, and the castle up on the cliff, and this little shepherd guy with his little flock down here, and the waterfall. Look how beautiful it is. Now, I don't have to tell you probably that the vast majority of scenes that people experienced during the Industrial Revolution looked nothing like this. They were living in living in places like this. This is what their reality looks like. This is much more realistic art, okay? This is not romanticized. This is, if anything, probably, too realistic. No one wants to look at this. It's drab, it's dreary, it's miserable, okay? But this is what people are living in, and they're trying to escape from it. And so what do? They seek out romanticized art that portrays things in a more perfect possible way than anything else. Now, as we move throughout the Industrial Revolution, here's what starts to happen. Romantic style of art starts to fall out of favor, and that's in part because there were a bunch of romantic political movements that also took place during the mid-1800s. There's a very famous year in European history known as 1848, the Year of Revolutions. And in 1848 and other surrounding years, there were a number of revolutions, liberal revolutions, where people were trying to once again revisit those ideas of the Enlightenment that had inspired the French Revolution and allowed France to move forward and make some changes to their society. And a lot of these romanticized political movements that took place in the mid-1800s failed. Most of them failed. And the reason they failed is because they had their head in the clouds, okay? They were overly idealistic. If you're overly idealistic and you're not realistic, you're not pragmatic, you're not practical, what ends up happening is you set these expectations that are going to be impossible to achieve. It's really important, especially in the realm of politics, to look at pragmatics, to look at what can be achieved, not just what we want to achieve. And this idea of romanticized art and literature and political movements falls out of favor. Not to mention, when people are living in this every day, Okay, when they're living in these kinds of scenarios every day and they're looking around and this is what society looks like, and then they take a look at a piece of art like this, or even some other styles where you see old noble estates that glorify agricultural living, and pretty much the only people who continued in England to live in agricultural areas were people who own the land and were able to afford to. Because increasingly, as technology improves, there's less and less and less jobs in agriculture, so people are forced to move to the city. And what happens with this is that romantic style art falls out of favor, because when you start looking at this, it's simply a reminder of something that you'll never live again. That no one is ever going to really live in this scene anymore. And the art starts to become something of a slap in the face. Right? The art starts to remind you of your own crappy existence. And so that's why people stop really focusing on the romantic style of art, and instead the art shifts after a period of time from romantic to being realist. Now, whoa, I didn't mean to do that. Realistic style art. Now, when I say realist art or realism, it's an art or a style of art or literature that expresses reality. In other words, actual conditions, okay? Actual conditions. So these pictures here, when I want to emphasize that when I talk about realism, I'm not saying that the art looks hyper-realistic. I'm not saying you're going to confuse the painting for a photograph. You're not going to look at this and say, oh my gosh, this looks so like perfect. It looks exactly like a photo or exactly like reality. That's not the point of it. The point is that the subject matter, what you're looking at in the art, is realistic. Okay, so why is this realistic? Why is this realist art? It's because this is the sort of thing that people did. These guys are like using these hammers to break up these rocks and stuff like that. They're of the working class. Who are these people? We don't even know who these people are. They're just nameless workers, okay? And the art starts to much more reflect this kind of common man, all right? Also, this piece here is also very realistic. Why? Because this is a scene that you actually would have seen in real life in perhaps a lower level peasant family. And you also see a man of African descent here. And there were people of African descent living in Europe in the 1800s for sure. And slavery by this point was outlawed, so there was no slavery in Europe at this time. But you did still have, Africans and also white folks who worked in servant-style positions. And so you can see that this is a lower-class family. They're not living in a palace. The room they're packed into here is pretty small. It's made of modest materials. It's not a bunch of fancy palatial, architectural stuff like, marble and gilded, it doesn't look like the Palace of Versailles by any stretch of the imagination. Also, you can see the clothing that they're wearing is very modest. A lot of these kids don't even have shoes on, all right? These are not nobles. These are people who are of kind of, average, maybe a little higher level peasant or lower level middle class background. And this is much more realistic, okay? Again, who are these people? We don't know. We don't know. It's not important. Any questions on the difference between realism and romanticism? Realism goes on to dominate in the latter half of the 19th century, the 1800s. So romanticism it starts in about the 1890s and lasts until about 1850. And then from 1850 onwards to the end of the 19th century, we see realism as the dominant art form. All right. Any questions on realism versus romanticism that I can address for you guys? If there's no questions, then I will continue to move on. Okay, reforms in industrialization. So how is it, I drew you a thing last time looking something like this, all right? I drew you a thing that looks something like this, and it was talking about how, it was talking about how quality of life goes something like this in the Industrial Revolution. It kind of goes down, and then it goes up, all right? I showed you something along this. And I said to you last class that right around right here, which is about the year, we'll say about 1840-ish, okay? Right around 1840, we start to see reforms made, okay? Reforms in government, all right? Reforms start to be made in 1840. How do those reforms get made? Well, the reforms get made by governments who start to implement changes in order to improve society. Now remember that because these changes were a lot of times coming from urban governments, okay, from urban populations, the cities that had been growing during the Industrial Revolution, as more people flocked to live and work in the cities, and as businesses and factories start to emerge in urban areas, those businesses are paying taxes to the government, and the government begins to use those tax dollars, the revenue that they're collecting, to start making laws that pass reforms to help to improve conditions for urban living and urban working conditions. So as we go back here, one of the ways in which these governments go about making reforms is they are pressured by unions. Now, what is a union? You may have heard of unions before, even recently, talking about the whole school situation going back, all right? As you probably know, the teachers are part of what's known as a union, okay? And it's a teachers union, and there's a lot of different kinds of unions out there. There's auto worker unions, there's plumber unions, there's electrician unions, there's construction unions, and so on and so forth. What are unions? Unions are simply organizations, groups of workers that operate as a single whole. And the idea behind unions is that unions played a very important part in history in trying to improve labor conditions for workers, okay? And so when we talk about unions, think about everybody who works in a textile factory unionizing, coming together, all right, to bargain with either the company or the government for better pay, shorter work days, better working conditions, and so on and so forth. Okay, so the unions will pressure the factory owners because, you know, your workers, any individual worker in the Industrial Revolution, they're not going to be particularly, powerful. Any individual worker is not going to be individually powerful, and their voice is not going to be heard. But when you take and you gather all of the union workers together and you start to voice your opinions as an entire group, those voices become louder. And the same is true in modern day unions. You know, with modern day unions, and I'll just level with you. I'll just be completely transparent with you guys. I'm not a huge union guy. Okay. I think that unions in a lot of cases protect bad workers, and that bothers me. You know, I don't like that aspect of unions. But there are other aspects of unions that, of course, that I appreciate. You know, being a part of the teachers union means that I benefit, even though I paid to be a part of the union, I benefit from the union going around and you know, bargaining with the district to make for better working conditions and pay raises and cost of living adjustments and other things like that. And so the union, for the teachers union in the union that I'm a part of, will go to the bargaining table with the district, and they will negotiate. And the union has lawyers and other people like that they employ, and the unions are able to advocate for the group of teachers. And any individual teacher who goes to the district with an issue is probably going to be ignored for the most part. All right, but if you unionize, then you are able to have a louder collective voice. Why do you have to pay to be in the union? You pay to be in the union because the union is doing work, and it's like anything. The union is its own organization. And so you're paying to be, it's almost like a subscription service where you're being afforded a service by the union. They're not doing it for free. They're doing it because the union has to pay lawyers and other people like that to be able to operate. And so, everything, you got to pay for everything, Arnav. I don't know what to tell you about that, man. Nothing comes free in life. Anyhow, so it's this group of workers, they bargain for better pay. And if factory owners refuse, here's the power of a union. If conditions get really bad, and if the factory owners refuse to make changes to help to address the concerns of the workers, what the workers can do as part of a union is they can go on strike or protest or refuse to work, okay? And so this is a problem too, because for factory owners, if there's a lot of people in the union itself becomes this organization that is able to initiate change, initiate reforms to get themselves heard. And if they are not listened to, okay, or if the factory owners are being completely unreasonable and refusing to change policies to make the workplace less dangerous or to improve people's pay so that they can afford to live a more comfortable life or whatever it is, then what the workers can do is they can go on strike, and the factory won't be able to produce anything, and the union can become very hostile towards people who work for the factory who are not part of the union. So if the factory tries to go and hire people who are not part of the union to fill those places, the union will be standing outside the factory waiting for those folks to arrive and then boo them, spit on them, etc., as they show up to work for the factory, which has denied the union's requests. And so, and of course, the people who have the most edge in a union are going to be your really skilled workers, because the skilled workers are the ones that are going to be missed the most if they were to go on strike. So your skilled workers within a union have an edge because basically, their labor is the one that is the most difficult to replace. And so this is the function of unions, and unions are very important during the Industrial Revolution era to help to change some of these laws. And so let's talk about some of these laws that get changed. Some of the labor reform laws that are pressured by unions, pressured to be put into place by unions, are some of the following laws. Now, originally, governments actually tried to outlaw strikes. They outlawed unions entirely, and they outlawed striking. But the pressures to continue being productive and have people working in factories and not striking became too great for the government to be able to handle. So eventually unions were allowed, and they start to make progress. And what are some of the pressures that they put on the government to change? Well, in 1833, child labor laws were passed that made it illegal to hire kids under the age of 9, meaning that companies were no longer allowed to hire kids 8 or younger. Now, of course, that's still very, very young. Okay, 9 years old, you're only in probably about 3rd grade or something like that, maybe 4th grade. But nonetheless, I mean, at least it's better than kids that are 6 years old working in these conditions. In just 9 years later, in 1842, labor unions pressured the government to pass a law that said that no kids could work in mines. All right, so they're cutting down on child labor. All right, and remember that child labor was really heavily used by early industrialization companies, factories, because you didn't have to pay kids as much money as you paid an adult. Same with women. Women often didn't get as much pay as men did in those days in particular, and so they limited the workday eventually to 10 hours. Remember that previously people were working 14-hour days, 6 days a week. Eventually they realized, like, oh my gosh, this is destroying the population. You have to understand, folks, that work is important. I'm not trying to say that work is not important. Work brings meaning to people's lives, because even though we all kind of gripe and groan about having to go to work or having to go to school, the fact of the matter is that working is important. But it's about having a balance. If your whole life is just being spent working and there's no balance away from that, life gets really miserable really quick. If all you're doing is work, okay, and it's very tiring, and you start to look at your life and think, what's the point? All I do is work, and my working conditions are miserable. My living conditions are miserable. My health is terrible. The pollution is unbearable. These kinds of existences were really, really tough on people. So starting in 1833, but especially by the time that we get to the 1840s, 1850s, the government starts to realize, like, I'll give you another example. Here's another example. In England, okay, to give you an idea of just how brutal life was for these workers, okay, they outlawed like recreational sports like soccer, okay, and think about, they don't call it soccer in England, they call it football, but the point being that think how important soccer is to Europeans these days, and back in those days too. All it is, people just wanted to go out and have some fun with friends, play a game of soccer and stuff like that. They outlawed it. And the reason they outlawed soccer is because who played soccer but for the working class people? Just simply trying to escape the misery, the drudgery of their day-to-day lives for an hour on Sunday or something like that. I mean, it's really punishing the kinds of restrictions that the government had. I'll give you another example. Another example is that as cities started to grow, they didn't want to waste 1 square inch of land. And so cities in the early Industrial Revolution had originally, basically created these jungles. Well, okay, so Arnav, the reason that they did that, the reason they outlawed soccer is because they were worried that if workers got together in their free time and started participating in these recreational activities, that maybe it would create riots, that maybe the laborers would come together and start causing trouble, okay, start rioting or rebelling or whatever. And so they wanted to crack down on that, so they made soccer illegal for a time in England. The other example that I was going to give you is that as these urban areas started to grow, not 1 square inch of land was designated to things like parks, trees, green strips. What do they call those things? Green belts. Okay, like patches of grass and stuff like that. They wanted to use every single square inch that there was in the city for building factories, building roads, building sidewalks, and so on. So you start to see these cities that have absolutely no greenery in them whatsoever. No trees, no parks, no places where there was any sort of nature to be found. And what this did, of course, is people realize, oh my gosh, cities are drab to live in. Not to mention, of course, they're horribly polluted, all right? And so, you go around these cities and there's not a single tree, there's not a single patch of land that looks like grass or anything like that. And how miserable, It might not seem like a big deal to you, but they've done studies on this about people's recuperation times in hospitals. They've done studies where if a person had no windows in their hospital room or had a window that looked outside facing a brick wall, their stay in the hospital was a lot longer than the people who had a window that looked outside to like trees or a park or some kind of nature. People recovered faster. And here's the thing, it's crazy to think about this, but to be honest with you, when you think about Eastvale, there's all sorts of parks and people have lawns and there's trees and other things like that. It's a pretty neighborhood to drive through, and because it's nice to drive through. People want to live there because it looks nice. People like having greenery in their everyday lives, and it seems like such a small thing. We don't even really think about it that much. But back in the olden days, when they got rid of all the greenery in the urban areas, people were depressed, okay? People are literally suicidal, okay, as a result of just, how drab their everyday existence is. And so that was another change. They start remapping the city and putting in things like parks and trees and other things like that, so that the city isn't just a complete garbage dump to live in and look at every single waking minute of your life. By the time that we get to 1904, child labor ends entirely. Now, here in the state of California, we have labor laws as well. There's tons and tons of labor laws, okay, about all sorts of different things. But one of them that you guys might be acquainted with is that you're not allowed to work until you're 16 years old. Okay, 16 is kind of the magic number. I think it's 16. Maybe it's 18 now. I'm not really sure. But 16 or 18 is the magic number where you could actually go out and get a job at, say, McDonald's or whatever other store. I don't even know other stores these days because most people buy things on Amazon. But is it 14? Garrett, that's not right. It's not 14. I don't think so. It used to be 14 when I grew up. When I was 14, I got a job at McDonald's. When I was in 8th grade, I was working at McDonald's. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's 16. At least for most places. It might be very, very rare, but there may be exceptions. I'm not really 100% sure on how it works. But anyhow, the point being that there are laws still even today that limit the age that you can actually go out and get a job, which is probably a good thing because, kids are going to school. As a kid who, I'm not a kid anymore, but when I was a kid, as a kid who went to school, and also had a job. So I worked my entire way through high school and through college. I was balancing working in all sorts of different places. I worked in high school. I worked at McDonald's. I worked at Office Max. I worked at Starbucks. And then after I graduated from high school, wow, it is 14, huh? It must be pretty rare then, because most kids that I know in Eastvale at least don't have jobs at 14. I can tell you that. Most kids don't even have jobs at 16 or even 18. I would say that the number of kids who go to Roosevelt High School and also work a job are pretty rare. It does happen. I've got a couple of seniors this year in my AP research class who have jobs. But other than that, those are the only kids that I know of who have jobs. And really, that's been a pretty recent thing. For the most of the time that I've been working at Roosevelt, most kids that I've had in my classes do not have jobs outside of work. The thing about working as a high schooler is that you're still going to school the whole day. So when I was a senior in high school, I was working anywhere from about, usually right around 24 hours a week, okay? I was working about 24 hours a week at Starbucks. So what would happen is I would wake up in the morning, I would go to school all day. My school ended when I was in high school. School got out at 2:15. I would go home, change into my Starbucks uniform, and drive out to Starbucks and start my job at 4 in the afternoon. And then I would work until close, and I would work from 4 until 10, and I'd do that 3 times a week. And then I would And then I would typically work a day or two on the weekend. So I'd work on either Saturday or Sunday. And so, and it was because if I didn't do that, it wasn't a guarantee that I would have been able to afford college without going into huge amounts of debt. And so by working my way through high school, I was able to save up money and help pay for my college education. And then when I was in college, I worked in factories. I worked at a video rental store and various other things as well. I did tutoring. I taught lessons, for music lessons and stuff like that. And so, but it was a way of earning a little bit of cash on the side to be able to keep myself afloat while I was doing college full time, So, and then once I got out of college, I immediately got hired. So I came, from Minneapolis where I grew up, I came out to California, and I had already worked many, many jobs. And I came to California. I still had to get my teaching credential in California. I got a job at Vaughn's. I've worked a ton of jobs throughout my lifetime. And this allowed me to be able to afford to live, basically, But as much privilege as I can say that I had growing up, in the sense that I had a family who loved me, and I never had to worry about there being food available or anything like that. I didn't grow up in the poorest of the poor conditions, but I didn't grow up a millionaire by any stretch of the imagination. I had to work in order to get by. And so work is important, but I will also add to that it's not the only thing in life. Working is important, but living is important too. And what these people are trying to do with these labor reform laws that they're getting passed is to try to incorporate time in their lives where they can work, where they can be with their families, where they can have a reprieve from the day-to-day working life that was expected of them. So, moving on, talking a little bit more about how industrialization spreads. The United States was much larger than Britain, or is much larger than Britain even today. And being that the United States was so huge, and also had the advantage of all of the agricultural regions in the South, the United States had many of the same resources that Britain had. Remember that when we first started this unit, we talked about the three factors of production: land, labor, capital. And when we talk about land advantages, we're talking about not only the natural resources available or how much land you have, but the stuff that the land can offer. Does the land have rivers? Does the land have agriculture? Does the land support the growth of crops or whatever? Or are there coal or iron ore deposits in the land that we could extract materials from? And so because the United States had many of the same advantages as Britain in terms of land resources, this helped the United States industrialize right alongside Britain. So early on, there was a British blockade and trade policy that forced the United States to develop separately and more slowly than Britain. But eventually what happens is that British people start to realize that there's money to be made over in America. And so there are a number of British inventors, British business people who are witnessing the growth of factories, the use of machines in factories to produce machine-made goods. And they bring over these blueprints for factories, for machines, and so on, and they start building them here in the United States and making a profit on it because the U.S. didn't have them yet. Remember that the time that we're talking about here in the late 1700s, the United States had just barely broken away from England about 15 years earlier at the turn of the century. And so, the United States is a real small-time country at this point. Very, very, very weak and a very fragile nation in many ways. And industrialization helps the United States to grow stronger and to grow economically and become another region on the planet that industrializes relatively quickly after the British entrepreneurs start bringing over some of these ideas that had been incorporated into British factories to the United States. Eventually, British workers, help to Eventually, British workers help start up. I think it should say help start up factories. Okay, and so northern states in the United States were the ones that experienced faster industrialization because the South remained highly agricultural, particularly after the invention of the cotton gin. The South reinvigorates the system of slavery, and the South extends slavery into the West. Places like Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, Missouri, Texas. All of these states end up becoming slave states, even Florida. And so all of these states started making plantations where they were growing, for the most part, cotton, but other things too, rice, sugar, things like that. But cotton, it makes up like over half of the United States exports because the United States, just by way of kind of happenstance, is able to grow cotton really, really, really well. And so a bunch of new cotton plantations that were worked by American slaves, black slaves in the South, end up lasting a lot longer into the 19th century than anyone had predicted during the American Revolution. Slavery was kind of on its way out during the American Revolution, but the cotton gin reinvigorates the demand for slavery in the United States as new plantations growing cotton start to pop up all over the American South. And so the South remains highly agricultural and dependent on manufactured goods from both Europe and from the North in the United States. The northern states, places like Massachusetts, New York, Pennsylvania, etc., start to industrialize, and they start to build these factories that are producing textiles and other goods that people can purchase, shoes, clocks, furniture, you name it. There's a whole bunch of things, that manufactured goods that are being made in factories now that people are wanting to purchase with money. One of the problems in the South that you had is that the vast majority of people living in the South were quite poor, even white people, okay? The reality about the South is kind of a confusing one that people don't really have a great grasp on. I think that most people think that the South was just a bunch of white people who owned slaves, but that's really not the case. The slavery proliferated in the South, not because most people owned slaves. In fact, at no point during the pre-Civil War era did most people in the South own slaves. Slaves were extraordinarily expensive, all right? But what it did was it created a situation where, because slaves were not free, slaves were considered property, and they weren't given, and they also, too, remember that the slaves were treated absolutely brutally, okay? What it created was a situation where even if you were a poor white farmer who may not have even owned any land, much less any slaves, you're still free. And so what happened in the South is that you had, in the southern United States, you had a very, 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 very wealthy, extraordinarily wealthy segment of the population that made up anywhere from about 1 to 3% of the population in the South. And that 1 to 3% are really the ones who owned the slaves. But what it did was it also stoked racial tensions between poor white folks and poor black folks in the South. So even if you were a poor white farmer in the South that didn't own any slaves, you still ended up being extraordinarily racist towards black folks, because if black folks had managed to gain their freedom, say in the early 1800s, that would have meant that there was nothing that meant that you were better than someone else in the South. And the wealthy segments of the population who owned these slaves very much pitted poor white folks against poor black folks against one another, deliberately to keep the society divided in the South on racial lines. And what this ended up creating, of course, is a system where even though there were a whole lot of poor white farmers that didn't benefit at all from the system of agriculture in the South and were barely scraping by to keep themselves afloat, they still would have supported the institution of slavery simply on the grounds that it was the only thing that separated your status as a poor white farmer in the South from a poor black slave in the South, was merely the fact that as poor as you got, as miserable as your life was, as difficult as it was to survive, at least you weren't a black slave in the South. And so that's why in the Civil War, when we talk about the American Civil War, why do Southerners go and fight to protect the institution of slavery, even though the vast majority of them don't own slaves? And it comes down to racial attitudes. Okay, it comes down to they didn't want to see slavery go away, because then there wouldn't have been anything that separated poor white folks from poor black folks in the South. All right. And I'm not excusing it. I want to be clear that I'm not saying that that's a good thing. I'm saying it's a tragic thing. All right. If people realized that that the strings were being pulled by, yes, Gareth, I did know that actually, and not to mention a lot of the reason that that slave women became pregnant is because of sexual assault by white slaveholders in the South. And so, even to be honest with you, even Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. He fathered slave children with one of the slaves that he owned. There have been genetic tests that have proven this. It's really, really messed up, but the reason I'm telling you guys about all this, and you got to keep in mind, I teach college level American history, okay, at Norco College, and I know what I'm talking about here. And the reason I tell you about this stuff is because the sooner that we can begin to acknowledge, embrace, understand, sympathize with the history, okay? As soon as we can begin to be honest about the history and not defend the history, okay, the sooner we can move forward and become a better society. The ultimate goal of and this goes back to my whole thing about why you're taking history in the first place. The ultimate goal, guys, of history is to get you to appreciate, understand the facts of what happened so that we can create a better future. I want you to consider, too, that just because slavery ended in 1865, that didn't mean that racism ended. And in the day-to-day lives of many black folks who lived in the South in a post-Civil War era, the late 1800s, still remained largely very, very vulnerable. There were all sorts of laws that were passed in the pre-Civil War era that made it so that that made it so that people who were slaves couldn't get an education. They couldn't read, they couldn't write, they had no life skills. The only skills they had were working on these plantations. And so just because slavery goes away doesn't mean that magically they're going to just go to Harvard or something like that. Of course not. Okay. It's a situation where you had an extremely vulnerable group of people in the South who needed all the help that they could get to try to improve their lot in life and make a turn away from having to do brutal agricultural labor on cotton plantations. But the fact of the matter is that even after the Civil War ends, a lot of these plantations stay around, and most of them continue to be worked by black laborers. Now they're, of course, not slaves anymore, but they're slaves in a new way. They're slaves in the sense that they don't have any options. They may not legally be slaves, but in terms of their experience, just because they're not slaves anymore, their experience didn't change that much. They may as well have still been slaves because of all of the racial terror that these folks began to face. The KKK, for example, comes out of the woodworks in about the 1880s. Okay, and the civil rights movement doesn't happen until my dad is in grade school. Okay, in the 1960s, my dad was in maybe about 4th or 5th grade, somewhere in that area, during the civil rights movement. Okay, so to consider that it's only been realistically 60 years, roughly, okay, if I'm being generous, okay, 60 years since the civil rights movement, all right, we are still seeing the after effects of the stone that was thrown into the pond of history back in the 16, 17, 18, and 1900s, and the ripple, the water ripple of where that stone hit in the history pond, flowing out. Just like when you throw a stone into a pond, you see ripples of water emanate off of that. And we are still living in those ripples today. And you see it everywhere, okay? Black Lives Matter. You see it with, the George Floyd killing. You see it with Trayvon Martin. You see it with real estate numbers and all of these other things, to demonstrate to people that we are still working our way through figuring out these racial tensions that were very much baked right into the bread of American history. And industrialization plays a big part in that, right? Even in the North, where slavery had already been outlawed, as we talk about the industrialization spreading in the northern United States, black laborers still found themselves at the very bottom of the social hierarchy, even though they weren't slaves, simply because of the racial tensions. And so black laborers found themselves competing with other people, Irish migrants, German migrants, Italian later on down the line migrants, and so on. And every one of them is competing against one another and hates one another based on their ethnic background. And that's just not a functional society, So Arnav, when you say it's not even about the history, it's just about having an understanding for other people, even if they don't look the same as you, I completely agree. But how do you convince people of that? So many people's ideas about other people are informed by a misguided representation of reality, beliefs, if you will, rather than looking at the actual facts. And the better educated you become about the history, you become better able to look at it through a less biased lens, because you're exposed to ideas substantiated by evidence that that will undermine your pre-existing beliefs about things, and force you to say, well, here's what I thought about this before, but now that I'm looking at this evidence, I'm realizing that what I thought was wrong, and I need to kind of adjust my understanding about things here. And so education is a real big part of people being able to make that jump that you're talking about, to have an understanding for other people, to have compassion for other people who may not look the same as you, or think the same as you, or believe the same religious beliefs that you do, or whatever it is. And that's why we take history, is so that you can make better sense of the people around you and things like that. History is a bunch of lies agreed upon. Napoleon Bonaparte. Well, I don't know what to say about that. In some sense, it goes to the point that I'm trying to make, which is that if you agree upon the lies, everybody's in the dark, right? Which is why becoming educated and not just agreeing upon the lies is so important, if that makes sense. So, we're seeing history change, folks. We're seeing history change. If you had been taking this class in 1920, okay, if you had been taking this class in 1920, do you honestly think that you'd be getting the whole picture? I think it's a credit, not only to me, but to a lot of history teachers across the nation, that they're trying to make history more inclusive. Do you really think that a teacher in 1920 or even in 1960 or even in 1980 would have spent the amount of time that I just spent talking about these kinds of ideas? Do you really think that? Because if you do, you're just flat out wrong. I can just tell you that. The mere fact that we're taking the time to talk about this should be itself evidence to you that the history is changing and that the things that people are learning about the history is much more inclusive. And it's trying to pay attention to people in history who have been ignored for a long time. I go out of my way in this class to talk about, for example, African Americans, okay? I go out of my way to talk about the experience of women, and these are segments of the population who traditionally in history have been ignored. So history is getting better. That's the point that I'm trying to make, as is your education in history. And it's designed to get you to care about other people than just yourself. That's what it's supposed to do. So cultural changes caused this conflict in the United States, of course, known as the Civil War. And the South supported slavery, the North supported abolition, or the getting rid of slavery. And the country expiratory quickly during this time, as we see here, these Western territories, much of which were purchased by Thomas Jefferson, during the Louisiana Purchase. Okay, but as the country starts to expand further westward, more and more and more states are being incorporated into the Union. And you can see here the North in the blue, the South in the gray. You kind of had these border states, some of whom supported the North, some of whom supported the South, places like Kentucky, Maryland, and so on. Generally speaking, these places, it depended on who you talked to in these regions as to whether they supported the North or the South. And then these Western territories were technically not involved in the Civil War because they weren't states yet. They weren't part of the actual country yet. They were just territories on the frontier. Gareth, let me just say I think history opened a door for me. I love it. It allows me to connect with the past and want a better life for the world. Hey, Gareth, I agree with you entirely. To me, the only way that we can make sense of the present and try to make a better future is to understand our past. How did we get to where we're at today? How can we change the mistakes of the past? How can we come to a point of honesty? How can we come to a point of not feeling defensive? Think about how many people get defensive when you start talking about stuff in history. And the reason people get defensive about it is because there's an identity to defend there. And what I'm trying to encourage you to do is to realize that your identity is something that you build. Okay? Your identity is not defined by your ancestors. Your identity is not defined by your nation's history. Your identity is defined by who you are as a person today and the things that you choose to value, the things that you choose to educate yourself on. So anyhow, take it from me, guys. As a white male, okay, who, my ancestry goes back centuries in the United States. Okay, my last name is Knight, for goodness sake. It doesn't get much more English than that. All right, there comes a point where you have to realize that whoever your ancestors are and whatever decisions that they made, okay, particularly for me, in the situation of a white male, I'm not going to go about defending the decisions or the beliefs of my ancestors. They lived in a different time and a different place, okay? There's nothing to defend there. The thing that we have to defend is the idea of learning from the mistakes of the past to try to pave a better way for the future. And so, for me, I'm not going to go around defending the choices that Americans made back in the early 1800s or 1700s or even in the 1900s. That's not my job. My job is to be honest about the history, to be able to communicate honesty, openness with you about the history so that we can all say, okay, look, this happened. Racial tensions are still present today in the case of the United States, in particular, as a result of some of these institutions that the country was built on, such as slavery. And to say, how can we move forward from that and make a better life for everyone, regardless of whatever our backgrounds may be. That's the whole idea here. But again, I've gone off on kind of a tangent here. But I really hope that this was a valuable class for you, because it's important to me that you feel included in the history. It's important to me that you feel included as a part of the process, and that you feel, in some sense, even maybe a responsibility to say, look, this is what happened. We acknowledge what happened, and we regret the decisions of people who founded the nation or whatever, and we want to make it so that we continue to improve and make a better one. So anyhow, folks, well, I am coming close here to exhausting my time. As one last little slide here that I'd like to provide for you, we'll just talk about how industrialization starts to expand in Europe. Remember that industrialization of Europe takes longer because the French Revolution had been breaking out, as well as the Napoleonic Wars, and that slowed Europe's industrial progress down. So the first nation to begin to industrialize in continental Europe, meaning this region of Europe right here, as opposed to Britain over here, which is an island and not part of the actual European continent, okay? The first region to begin to industrialize is Belgium, right in this region right here, okay? And the Netherlands follows very shortly thereafter, just a little further to the east here. So the Belgium is the first continental country to begin to industrialize, and many of the designs that they were using in Belgium to begin to industrialize were, again, taken from British engineers who went to Belgium, brought their designs with them, and began making money in Belgium using those designs that had already been incorporated in England, just like they did with America. Germany, on the other hand, industrializes a little later. They had been divided. Germany resides in kind of in this region right here, okay, to the east of France. All right, Germany. There were kind of pockets of industry that you can see here on this map in orange and red. That where you see industrialization start to crop up in these different regions here, and then also a little bit further east, and then also in northern Germany up in this region up here. And other areas of Germany remained more agricultural, particularly the further south you get into like Austria and stuff. It starts to become much more mountainous, and so there's not going to be much industry that pops up there. much more likely is it's going to take place along major riverways like the Rhine River or the Seine River that runs through Paris over here, and so on. And that's where we start to see urban industrial centers grow in Europe. By the late 1800s, Germany became this industrial and military giant. And so there's this process of industrialization that is a little bit slower to take hold in Germany. But as Germany begins to industrialize, you're going to see that they take off like crazy. And they start to develop all sorts of new technologies. And there's actually, they sometimes say in the late 1800s, there's actually a second industrial revolution as Britain starts to kind of like plateau and flatten out in terms of their productivity. Germany takes the reins and starts to grow tremendously during that time, as does America as well. So there's also going to be kind of a second industrial revolution that we're going to be talking about as the 19th century progresses into the later 1800s, 1870s, 1880s. We start to see early auto manufacturers like Mercedes come around during that time. In the late 1800s, and other technologies start to develop too, like electricity, telegraphs, and stuff like that. So there's a bunch of new technologies that start to be developed in the second industrial revolution at the very, very tail end of the 19th century, the 1800s. And folks, that is going to do it for our lecture here today. So I just want to say thank you so much for listening to me ramble on this morning about history. I hope that you have a wonderful rest of the day. I will see you back tomorrow morning for second period, and we'll continue to make progress. Just letting you know, we are coming up towards the end of this unit here. We'll probably be testing on it sometime late next week, and so to put that on your radar so that you know that that's probably going to be coming down the pike here relatively soon. All right, folks, have a great rest of the day, and we'll see you back here tomorrow.